Hey everyone, my name is Mike Scaife and I work as the Biologist and Recreation Specialist for the Washington County Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP. This is our Desert Tortoise Awareness Training video. Whether you've never gone through a tortoise awareness training course before, or whether you're just doing your annual refresher, this will satisfy your requirements for that for any project occurring within tortoise habitat here in Washington County. In this video, we're going to be talking about protocols for working within desert tortoise habitat, whether that's within the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve or out on private lands. And we'll touch on both a pre-project planning as well as the actual implementation of those projects. We're also going to touch on a history and timeline of the Washington County HCP and the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve and how it was established to begin with. We'll also be discussing what to do if you ever encounter a desert tortoise, whether that's out in its habitat or maybe an area where we wouldn't want to see a tortoise, like on a roadway or elsewhere in an urban area. We're going to touch on where you might find desert tortoises here in Washington County and some basic desert tortoise biology and what desert tortoise sign looks like. And then as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, we'll also touch on what those threats are that tortoises are facing and why their numbers are on the decline. We'll also touch on the outdoor recreation opportunities that you'll find in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, as well as some of the other wildlife that you might encounter, because the reserve does provide protection for other species, not just desert tortoises. While this video is geared towards utility and construction crews working in desert tortoise habitat here in Washington County, there's other information here that may just be of general interest to you, even if that part of it doesn't apply. And so what I would say is if you did stumble across this video and you were not on a work crew, you may still get something out of this. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and launch into desert tortoise awareness training. Really appreciate you tuning in. And I think most of you know how to get a hold of me if you have any additional questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out. To better understand why the Washington County Habitat Conservation Plan and the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve exist, we're going to go back to the year 1990, and that's the year that the Mojave population of the desert tortoise was first listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. It was shortly thereafter that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued critical habitat designations in Washington County. That included the site of the present-day Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, but also included some private lands. And this did create an issue for Washington County because this was happening during one of the first big waves of economic growth and development in the area. And in order to continue this growth, the county would have to put together a plan to protect the tortoise. The plan that was finally agreed upon did take a few years to come together, but eventually in 1996, the Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP, was established, and this plan simultaneously protected the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve while also allowing growth and development to occur on private lands in other areas, including areas of desert tortoise habitat. One of the most critical parts of the HCP was the issuance of an incidental take permit. This incidental take permit, or ITP, is what allows us to get ahead of construction equipment and move tortoises off of private lands, but it also accounts for the possibility that occasionally accidents may occur. So if there ever is an accident involving a tortoise on a construction site, our incidental take permit does account for those instances. Of course, we want to do everything we can to prevent that from happening, but if there is an accident, we're not going to make anyone feel guilty about it. We just ask that you report that incident to us right away. This HCP and incidental take permit has created a much simpler and more streamlined process for development to occur, because without it, each time a developer would try to develop the land on their property, they would have to do their own private consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service and figure out how they're going to protect tortoises on their property, and it would be kind of a mess. So keep in mind, one of our main roles with the HCP is to help simplify this process. Yeah, we're going to take measures to protect desert tortoises, but it's also important to us that you're getting your projects completed, and the bottom line here is that we are your friends, not your enemies. Our HCP is funded by impact fees paid by developers, and these funds pay for pretty much everything we do, including tortoise surveys, fire and habitat management, recreation management, law enforcement patrols, outreach and education, tortoise fencing, installation and maintenance, raven management, and other types of research. When planning for a utility project proposed within the boundaries of the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, we generally follow our Utility Development Protocols, or UDPs. These UDPs are summarized here, but we also highly recommend reading the actual document, which we can send you. One of the most important considerations to be aware of is the distinction between the less active season and the active season. The less active season window, when tortoises are usually underground, is December 1st through February 14th. And usually desert tortoise protection measures don't have to be as strict during this less active season. However, this can depend on the size and scope of the project. The remainder of the year is considered the active season, and any projects that occur within the active season may require more planning and approvals, and they may end up being more costly for the project proponent. For example, you may be asked to hire a full-time desert tortoise monitor and install temporary tortoise fencing that needs to be checked daily. Probably the most important takeaway is to let us know when you are still early on in the planning process for a project, and we can kind of walk you through the process, let you know what might be required to get it approved, and to make sure that we are notifying any other agencies that may need to be involved. For any projects occurring on private lands, a tortoise survey may be required if it's occurring within a take area. These are areas of tortoise habitat where development can occur, but we just need to make sure that we are moving as many tortoises as possible out of harm's way before construction begins. There is both a springtime and a fall window for these clearance surveys to occur, so make sure you are getting these projects on our radar in advance so we can plan accordingly. An important consideration is that the time required to complete a tortoise survey can greatly vary, and it just depends on the size and the scope of the project, as well as how many tortoises we encounter. So again, just to reiterate, try to get these projects on our radar well in advance, and we will try to get them completed in as timely a fashion as possible. Here are some just general project considerations to keep in mind. If a tortoise does show up either within or near your project area, make sure you report it to whoever the on-site crew lead is or project foreman. If it's on private property, make sure you contain it in a box and place it out of harm's way. Definitely want to keep it in the shade, especially if it is a hot day. And contact us with the HCP as soon as possible, and we will come right away and pick up that tortoise. And there really shouldn't be any delay to your project at all. Keep in mind that our HCP accounts for the fact that sometimes tortoises are going to be missed and will show up in construction zones. If this does happen, we're not looking to get anyone in trouble. We're certainly not looking to shut down any projects. We just need to make sure that we are following the proper channels and reporting these tortoises. We want everyone to know that over the years, we've really established some great relationships with the local municipalities and construction crews. And yeah, we do need to make sure we're following steps to protect tortoises, but we also want to make sure you're getting your projects completed in a timely manner. When tortoises are removed from private property, they receive health assessments, and if they're healthy, they can eventually be released into a designated part of the reserve. And to date, ongoing survival of translocated tortoises in our area has been very successful, which can't necessarily be said for all other parts of the Mojave. For very sick tortoises or tortoises that have been held in captivity for a long period of time, under our current protocols, those tortoises cannot be released back out into the wild. Those individuals will go into an adoption program that's managed by the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. As it stands right now, only residents of Utah outside of Washington County are allowed to keep desert tortoises as pets. When discussing the reserve, we do spend a lot of time talking about desert tortoises, and for good reason. However, there are a number of additional species that have benefited from the protected status of the reserve. Similar to the tortoise, many of these species are found at the far northern end of their range here. That includes other reptiles like sidewinders, Gila monsters, and chuckwallas. Birds at the very end of their range here include the ladder-backed woodpecker and cactus wren, plus numerous species of Mojave desert plants. Washington County is the most biologically diverse county within the state of Utah, and that's largely because of the convergence of 3 different ecosystems in our area: the Mojave Desert, the Great Basin, and the Colorado Plateau. As important of an area as the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve is for wildlife, you could make the argument that it's just as important for people as well. There are about 200 miles of non-motorized trails within the reserve, providing opportunities for hiking, mountain biking, and equestrian use. And rock climbing is also very popular within the reserve. While the reserve is mostly an area for non-motorized recreation, there are some limited motorized routes, such as the Babylon Road near Leeds. If you're interested in a Red Cliffs Desert Reserve trail map, come on down to our visitor center located on the first floor of the Washington County Administration Building. These maps are available for purchase at our front desk. The present-day Red Cliffs Desert Reserve is about 62,000 acres, and it includes all the lands immediately north of our major communities here in Washington County. At some point in the future, it's possible that the reserve could expand to include an area that we're calling Zone 6. Zone 6 encompasses about 6,800 acres west of Bloomington and would include both BLM and state lands. Washington County has proposed Zone 6 as mitigation to make up for the impacts that would be caused by the Northern Corridor Highway. This is a road proposal that would bisect the southern portion of the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve between Green Springs and Red Hills Parkway. Primary land managers in the reserve are shown here roughly in order of how much land they manage. The majority of the reserve is managed by the BLM, and these BLM lands have been designated as the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area, or NCA. This is a federal designation, and back in 2008, this kind of added an extra layer of protection to the BLM lands that were already contained within the boundaries of the reserve. The state of Utah is also a significant land manager within the reserve, and that includes Snow Canyon State Park. There are also smaller portions of municipal property as well as private inholdings within the reserve. Washington County does not directly manage most of the land in the reserve. However, we do partner with other agencies to get projects done, and we often provide funding or assistance for projects that are going to be beneficial to desert tortoises and tortoise conservation. Same thing goes for recreation management and outreach and education. While driving any of the roads that bisect the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve or run along the reserve boundary, we do ask that you please respect the posted speed limit signs. Also be aware that occasionally we may establish some project-specific speed limits, especially if there's not an existing posted speed limit. And we may want to be especially cautious with speed limits if there's no existing tortoise fencing in the area. This photo really illustrates the importance of keeping your eyes peeled for desert tortoises and other wildlife whenever you're driving the roads that either bisect the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve or run adjacent to it. Circled in the foreground is a baby desert tortoise that I encountered on the Cottonwood Springs Road just a few weeks ago. Luckily, I was paying attention, but even as I approached, I wasn't 100% sure it was a tortoise until I hopped out of my truck and took a closer look. So the takeaway here is that if you can do so safely, it's better to pull over and take a closer look before just continuing to drive. Even if you see something that just looks like it kind of resembles a tortoise, it might just end up being a rock or a piece of road debris, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Keep in mind that every year some tortoises do end up getting killed on our roads, and they are often little guys like this one. This example also shows that sometimes tortoises are able to escape from the reserve, even areas that are fenced. Both sides of the Cottonwood Road are fenced for the first few miles, and yet as we see here, tortoises do still sometimes find ways to escape. If you were to encounter a desert tortoise in a similar type of situation, we do ask that you please help those tortoises off the road and out of harm's way. In this example, this tortoise was moving from right to left, and so what we would want to do is move that tortoise the direction it's headed and place it across the tortoise fencing, assuming there's tortoise fencing in that area. Since both sides of this roadway are fenced, if the tortoise was moving the opposite direction, you would want to help the tortoise across the road in that direction instead. If you do end up moving a tortoise across a roadway, please be as gentle as possible. If it's a larger tortoise, you'll definitely want to pick it up with both hands. Then as you're moving it across the road, please keep it fairly low to the ground. Try to avoid any unnecessary side-to-side movements or tipping the tortoise upside down, because you might increase the chances of the tortoise voiding its bladder, which we want to avoid. And when you're ready to set it down on the other side of the fence, make sure you do so as gently as possible. In this example, we have a road that runs along the boundary of the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve. This photo shows 600 North in Hurricane. And in this instance, if you were to encounter a tortoise, it doesn't matter what direction it's headed because the reserve is only on one side of the road. So we would ask that you please gently place the tortoise over the reserve fencing on the north side of the road, because the south side of the road is private property and that tortoise is still in harm's way in that area. Last thing to note on this is that we really would like a report on the location of this tortoise so we can go and inspect the fence and make any repairs if needed. So hopefully this isn't a recurring problem in this area. Keep in mind that what we've been discussing here with moving tortoises off of roads is kind of the exception to the rule. We don't want you to hesitate to move tortoises when they're in harm's way, but keep in mind if you do encounter tortoises out in their natural habitats, like out in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, we definitely don't want to touch or pick up those tortoises or do anything that might startle them. And the main reason for that is because if tortoises are startled, they can sometimes void their bladder. And that can be really bad because as a drought adapted species, tortoises are able to kind of efficiently use those water reserves in their system to stay hydrated even during periods of drought. If they lose those water reserves, that can be a really bad situation. If they don't get that water intake again over the next few months, they might end up slowly dying of dehydration. Now, if a tortoise is on a road or somewhere else where it's in immediate harm's way, in those situations, we'd rather take our chances on the possibility that the tortoise might void its bladder, just because that's still going to be a better situation than if the tortoise were to get hit by a vehicle. There are some other rare examples where it might be appropriate to pick up a tortoise, and one example of that would be if a tortoise were to show up in an urban area, if a tortoise shows up in someone's yard or on a roadway that's way away from tortoise habitat. In those situations, it's best to contain the tortoise in a box. Make sure that box is placed somewhere in the shade and somewhere where it's safe, and give us a call right away or call the urban wildlife number and we'll come pick up that tortoise. In these situations, it's really important to take note of exactly where that tortoise was found, because that's going to help us out a lot when trying to figure out what needs to happen with that tortoise, and if that tortoise can be released back out into the wild, where exactly we want to release it. Because if we do have reason to suspect that the tortoise came from a nearby population, we would want to put it back out in the area that it came from. Just one more quick note on finding tortoises in unwanted or unexpected places. Whenever your vehicle has been parked out in the desert, it's a really good habit to check under all four of your tires before you drive away, especially during the summer. Tortoises might be attracted to the shade beneath your vehicle and may find their way under there to rest up as they're looking to get out of the heat of the direct sun. So as you may imagine, if you just go to drive away without checking, that could be a pretty bad situation. So again, just a good habit to get into. Walk a quick circle, check under all those tires, just on the off chance that a tortoise might be shaded up under there. I'm up in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve right now, and I found a spot that I think really showcases some excellent desert tortoise habitat. In the background there, you see some nice sandstone, rocky areas. They really love those spots for sheltering and burrowing. In the foreground, you see some creosote bush, which is a Mojave Desert shrub that's probably most associated with tortoise habitat, although there are a number of others as well. Also seeing some ephedra. Back to kind of the terrain here, lots of rocky sandstone areas. They really love that. And then across this big wash, we also have some basalt. These kind of basalt ridges and these slopes. Tortoises really love those areas as well. And it's quite surprising to a lot of people just how steep of terrain we often find tortoises in. So that slope right there would definitely not be too steep for a tortoise to navigate. And then again, down below, we have that nice wash. Tortoises often are found near washes. A lot of good forage grows in those areas. And so this area right here, I think just really showcases an area where, you're likely to find a good number of desert tortoises. And I did see quite a bit of tortoise sign as I hiked into this spot as well. Here in Washington County, we generally find desert tortoises in areas below 4,000 feet in elevation. However, there are some exceptions to that. For example, out in the Springdale area, there is a small population of desert tortoises, so occasionally you might find tortoises up in pinyon juniper habitats, but for the most part, they tend to prefer those lowland Mojave Desert shrub habitats. In front of me, we have a really nice example of a desert tortoise burrow. Right off the bat, I can tell there's a good chance that this is a tortoise burrow because of the general shape of the entrance being kind of like that nice low dome shape. And then there's also a dirt apron where that burrow was excavated by a desert tortoise, or possibly in combination with some other animals. And so those are a couple of initial things that I look for, and we do often see kind of like that rocky shelf as well. And tortoises really like those if they can burrow under them, because there's a good chance that's never gonna collapse. I've moved closer to the entrance of this burrow, and I'm seeing additional signs that it has been occupied by a desert tortoise, or possibly even multiple desert tortoises. This one goes quite deep and may be a winter burrow. I'm also seeing quite a bit of tortoise scat, both back in the burrow and right here at the entrance. And generally the fresher scat is going to be darker, the older stuff's going to be more kind of white and bleached. Doesn't look like this burrow has been in use anytime really recently, but there's some fairly fresh scat, so probably over the last few months I wouldn't be surprised if a tortoise has been hanging out in here. This really is an excellent example of the types of tortoise burrows that we'll find in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve. All desert tortoise burrows do look a little bit different, and it really can just depend on what type of substrate they're burrowing into. And so here's just a few different examples of different looking tortoise burrows in different types of terrain. The depth and overall size of the burrow can also vary, and a lot of times that can just depend on the size of the tortoise that dug the burrow. And winter burrows tend to be much deeper than summer burrows, because in the winter, tortoises need to dig back to where the ground is no longer freezing, whereas in the summer, they're looking to just get out of the direct sun. In sandy areas, sometimes we encounter tortoise tracks. Shown here are some tortoise tracks on the Babylon Road out near Leeds, and what we see is a parallel running set of footprints, slightly offset from one another. Depending on the size of the tortoise, those tracks might be spaced only about an inch apart for a hatchling, all the way up to about 5 or 6 inches apart for a large adult. Desert tortoises are vegetarians and eat a wide variety of different grasses, flowers, and leafy greens. They tend to prefer native vegetation, however, they will also eat non-native plants, especially when their native food sources are scarce. Some invasive species like cheatgrass do not have much nutritional value for tortoises and can actually cause some health issues, especially when it dries out. Many people refer to our native desert tortoises in southern Utah as turtles, and while tortoises do fall under the umbrella of the turtle family, a tortoise actually refers to something more specific, which is basically a land-dwelling turtle. There are some non-native turtles and tortoises that are found in our area, and the bottom left and bottom right photos here show a red-eared slider and a spiny softshell. These are both aquatic turtles that you might find at golf course ponds or down along the Virgin River, but you'll never see them very far from a body of water. Desert tortoises, on the other hand, seen here in the middle, are exclusively land dwellers, and it's very unlikely you'll ever see them entering water. However, they will sometimes come out to drink water when it rains, especially during monsoon season. Also shown here at the very top are 2 tortoise species that are commonly kept as pets, and while these species are not native to the area, they do sometimes escape from people's yards and might show up in unexpected places. The top left photo shows a sulcata, also known as an African spurred tortoise, and the top right shows a Russian tortoise. These species can more closely resemble desert tortoises compared to those aquatic species at the bottom. However, there are still some distinct differences. We're not going to dive into identification right now, but it's good to be aware that these other species could be out there. If you ever come across one of these other species and it kind of looks out of place, especially if it's up in the reserve, that's something that we'll definitely want to know about. So give us a call, we'll come take a look, and we'll decide if anything needs to be done. There are a number of threats that desert tortoises face that contribute to their decline. Here in southern Utah, one of their major threats that has contributed to a lot of habitat loss is the threat of wildfire. Wildfire in desert tortoise habitat is especially destructive when combined with invasive plants like cheatgrass. And the reason is because these invasive plants can be really widespread across the landscape, and when they dry out, they can carpet the landscape with dry fuels. These dry fuels are what allows wildfire to burn much more quickly and spread much larger than what we would have found in the Mojave Desert decades ago before there were as many invasive plants. And unfortunately, after these areas burn, the native vegetation that tortoises like to eat or use for cover usually does not come back nearly as well as the invasive plants. What this means is even if tortoises can survive the initial impacts of the wildfire, the landscape that remains in this area can be very difficult for desert tortoises to continue to thrive. Other threats include the loss of habitat as a result of human development, and there are a lot of examples of this. This could include the building of roads, just general human growth and development that either encroaches upon or fragments habitat. There have also been some disease outbreaks that have impacted tortoises. The most common is one called an upper respiratory tract disease. This isn't necessarily a death sentence, but if a tortoise goes through, for example, a stressful environmental event like a drought or a wildfire, this can worsen the impacts of the disease, and sometimes it can kill tortoises. Illegal collecting and keeping tortoises as pets probably isn't as big of an issue as maybe it used to be, because people probably know they could get in big trouble for that. However, we still find tortoises that show up in weird areas where they definitely didn't get there on their own, and so there is some indication that this continues to be an issue. Since desert tortoises don't reach reproductive maturity until they're somewhere between about 15 and 17 years old, this can be an issue for tortoises simply because so many of them don't live long enough to reproduce. Until they're about 8 to 10 years old, they're still very vulnerable to predators. Two of the main predators of tortoises include ravens and coyotes. Both of these species have been extensively documented preying on tortoises, and in some parts of the Mojave, these predators have been consistently identified as some of the top threats that tortoises face. It should be noted that both ravens and coyotes are considered subsidized predators, and their populations have really exploded in areas closer to human development. So the various things that humans have introduced to the landscape, especially things like landfills, dumpsters, artificial water sources, and power lines in the case of ravens, just to name a few, have really contributed to their populations exploding over the last few decades. You can help us out with predator management by doing a few simple things, including packing out your food scraps and just properly disposing of all trash. Make sure that you're closing dumpster lids, especially in areas that are near open desert and the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve. These simple things may help to reduce the chances of predation on tortoises. Note that there are a number of additional threats that tortoises face, but what we've been discussing here are the threats most often identified in Washington County. Last but not least, here are some important contacts for you to save. Starting from the top, that is our front desk phone number with the HCP. Moving on down, we have the Urban Wildlife on-call number, and that's the best number to call if you ever have a wildlife-related issue that's outside of normal business hours. So if it's after 5 p.m. or on a weekend, someone should be available at that number. They may not be able to respond immediately, but if you leave them a message, they should be able to get back to you shortly. Also included here is the number for the Washington County Sheriff's Office dispatch. If you ever encounter a law enforcement issue out in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve or elsewhere, and you think it's worth reporting, but it may not rise to the level of an emergency, this is a good number to have. We really do appreciate you reporting anything that might be in violation of the reserve's rules and regulations. The last contact I've included here is my email address, and that's usually the best way to get a hold of me. If we need to coordinate directly on a particular project, let me know, and I'd be happy to give you my cell number as well. And that concludes our Desert Tortoise Awareness Training video. Thanks so much for everyone for sticking around to the very end. We do like to keep track of everyone who's been through this training, so please make sure that you send us a list of everyone with first and last names, as well as whatever organization you're with. And we'll keep that for our records just to show that we're covering all of our bases and just to show that everyone's trained up on the material that we covered here. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with the Washington County HCP anytime. And don't forget to get those projects on our radar well in advance.